So let me stop my video to make sure my Zoom does not die. All right. So welcome to our 9th NWB User Days workshop. My name is Oliver Rübel. I am a staff scientist in the Data Analytics and Visualization Group at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. I'm the lead PI together with Lydia Ng from the Allen Institute for Brain Science of the NIH Brain Initiative grant that currently funds the development of NWB. And I have been involved in a leading role in the development of NWB 2.0 since late 2016. In this talk, I will give you an overview of NWB and the larger NWB neurophysiology data standardization ecosystem. And I will discuss how NWB helps drive collaboration in neuroscience. And since we're here at the user days, I will focus today mainly on the aspects that are relevant to end users rather than developers. So first, I'm going to discuss some of the challenges that motivate NWB, and then I will give a high-level overview of what NWB is. Afterwards, I'm going to give a quick overview of NWB data analysis, visualization, and management tools. And I'm then going to give you an introduction to the core NWB data standard ecosystem, which includes the tools that most of you will work with in your coding projects during this workshop. And so finally, circling back to the motivation, I will conclude by discussing some of the energy barriers in data standardization and how we address these challenges. So let's get started. So first of all, neurophysiology data are expensive to collect. But at the same time, neuroscience data sets are often very rich and can be used to answer many different questions, even years after acquisition. Reusing data saves money and time, and it reduces animal use. But unfortunately, currently data often have limited reuse outside of the purview of the original experiment. Second, sharing neurophysiology data within a lab and with collaborators is tedious. Everyone has a different way of storing the data, and metadata required for interpretation of the data is often missing or stored ad hoc. And finally, scientific results and analysis are hard to reproduce and compare. Processing, analyzing, visualizing neurophysiology data requires converting the data from one esoteric format to another, while important metadata is often inconsistent or missing completely. And so it is the combination of these and other issues that ultimately makes lack of standards for neurophysiology data and related metadata the single greatest impediment to fully extract return on investment from neurophysiology experiments, which impedes interchange and reuse of data, as well as reproduction of derived conclusion. And so this is one of the main motivations why we developed NWB. So what then is NWB? NWB is an ecosystem for neuroscience data standardization. But what does this really mean? Well, so first of all, NWB defines a unified data standard for neurophysiology data. And it's focused on the dynamics of groups of neurons measured under a large range of experimental conditions. NWB supports a broad range of data types from end-to-end neurophysiology experiments, which includes recordings of neural activity via extracellular and intracellular electrophysiology, as well as optical physiology. It includes behavioral data, as well as metadata about the acquisition, such as devices, experimental design, such as stimuli and trial structure, and experimental subjects. NWB also supports formal extensions, which allow the addition of new data types and modalities, as well as metadata that is specific to labs, acquisition systems, processing tools, and analysis tools, or experiments. And NWB technologies are really at the heart of the neurodata lifecycles. Data standards are a critical conduit that facilitate the flow of data throughout the data lifecycle, from acquisition, processing, and analysis to publication, preservation, and reuse. And they facilitate the integration of data and software across these different phases of the data lifecycle. What this means is that NWB needs to support the needs of and integrate with technologies across the data lifecycle. Our goal with NWB here is to work with, not compete with, existing and emerging data technologies. One expression of this is You will see many talks and breakout sessions on the agenda this week are really about tools that were developed by the community rather than technologies that we as the NWB core team have developed directly. And finally, NWB is a standard for, not of, neurophysiology experiments. What I mean with this is that with NWB, we do not aim to standardize neurophysiology experiments, but what we aim to standardize is how we save and share data from those experiments. But NWB is more than just a file format. It defines an ecosystem of tools, methods, and standards for storing, sharing, and analyzing complex neurophysiology data. Here you can see a simplified view of the NWB software ecosystem. At the foundation, we have the NWB data standard schema, which defines the rules of how to organize experimental data and metadata, which is what is required. It would define what is required to interpret the data, what to call different fields, where do we place them within the format, and so on. And then there's also extensions to NWB data standard, which are managed in the Neurodata extension catalog. And so those are the places where you can define additional fields that are specific to your experiments. And then using the PyNWB and MetNWB reference APIs allows users to easily create, read, and write and use NWB files while ensuring compliance with the NWB data standard. These tools also include additional tools for extending NWB, validating NWB files, and other essential functionality for using NWB files and interacting with the data standard. High-level tools, which are shown in red, then facilitate the conversion of data and introspection and exploration of NWB files, as well as the creation and documentation of extensions, among others. And then finally, there is a growing collection of community software for data analysis, visualization, and management that use NWB technologies and provide additional rich functionality to end users. And so before I dive into the core NWB data standard ecosystem, let's have a look at some of the NWB data analysis, visualization, and management tools that are available from the broader community right now, many of which you will have a chance to get to know in more detail during the breakout sessions as part of this workshop. And so to give you a quick overview, I'll divide the tools along two main axes. One is the programming environment, web, MATLAB, Python, and others, as well as then the neuroscience applications, electrophysiology, behavior, optical physiology, and intracellular physiology. And so I'm going to start first with cross-application tools and then go step by step more to application-specific tools. And so first up are the PyNWB and MetNWB APIs. Those are the reference APIs for NWB. And you will be able to learn more about both APIs in the tutorials during this workshop. Next up is the Distributed Archive for Neurophysiology Data Integration, DANDI, which is a cloud platform for neurophysiology data storage and sharing. It provides software and APIs for data submission, ingestion, and access to the archive. And DANDI will support NWB-aware search and interactive visualization tools. And it's the official neurophysiology archive for the US Brain Initiative. Next up are NWB widgets and NWB Explorer, which are general purpose visualization tools for exploring and visualizing NWB files. And then DataJoint is a free open source framework for programming scientific databases and computational data pipelines. It is useful, for example, to manage analysis pipelines, and it can also be used to manage NWB files. Cayman, Sweet2P, and calcium image analysis are sophisticated tools for calcium image analysis in Python and MATLAB, respectively. Spike interface is an interesting tool for electrophysiology. It defines standardized Python API that unifies data formats and spike sorting algorithms. Spike interface provides you access to a broad range of spike sorters while allowing your data to remain in NWB both for input and for output. EcoVis is a tool for quality control and annotation processing of electrophysiology data. And then finally, MEES is a suite-based data acquisition tools used for intracellular electrophysiology recording, and it's written in Igor Pro. And so this just gives you a rough overview of some of the analysis tools that are available to you right now for NWB, and that you will be able to hear more about in this workshop. And so we expect more tools to add support for NWB in the near future. For example, we're actively working with OpenEFIS, NEO, JR-Class, and ScanImage to support NWB, and there's a bunch of other tools we're also engaging with right now, Rave, Dobby, Deep LabCut, and others to add support for NWB. And so to learn more about NWB-enabled tools, visit the NWB Tools Show.
Oliver, sorry, I accidentally muted you.
Yes. Someone muted me.
Sorry about that.
Where did we stop?
Right at the start of the slide, I think.
Right at the start of the slide. All right, thank you, Ryan. Well, so what I said was we expect more tools to also add support for NWB in the near future. For example, we're working with OpenEFIS, NEO, JR-Cluster, and ScanImage right now to add support. And we're also working with a number of other tools such as Rave, Dobby, and Deep LabCut, and others to add support. And so if you want to learn more about these tools, visit the NWB Showcase, which will happen right after this talk, as well as the elective in-depth tool breakouts, which are happening in the afternoon in the next 3 days. And so visit the tool developers, engage with them, learn about the tools. They're really cool. All right, and so now that you have a high-level overview of some of the things NWB can do for you, let's have a peek under the hood and take a look at some of the core technologies in the NWB data standard ecosystem that make NWB work. And so one of the key challenges in the development of experimental data standards like NWB is the diversity of stakeholders and data challenges and requirements at the different phases of the data lifecycle, from acquisition to analysis and publication. A key aspect that has allowed us to manage these diverse requirements and discussions is that we already early on clearly outlined the main components that we need to make work in order to create a functioning data standard. And those components are outlined in the triangle here. So first, we have the NWB Specification Language, which allows us to formally define neuroscience data standards. The data standard schema, shown in orange, then uses the specification language to organize complex collections of neuroscience data. So this is probably the component that most of you will think of as the standard. And then the data storage component then looks at how can we take the objects from the specification language and the schema and store large collections of neuroscience data on disk. And then finally, the data APIs allow us to efficiently interact with neuroscience data to read, write, query, analyze the data we generate. And so the next few slides, we're briefly going over each of these different components. And so first up is the specification language. The role of the specification language is to allow us to formally define the data objects like groups, data sets, links, attributes, as well as their features such as the names, data types, dimensions, and descriptions that we use to model the data. And a core concept in the specification language then is the idea of neurodata types. So if you're familiar with object-oriented programming, you can think of a neurodata type as a class. A neurodata type defines a high-level data type, such as a time series, that we can then reuse in the specification through inheritance as well as composition. And so NWB also supports the extension of the data standard using the same specification language and rules. The data standard schema then uses the NWB specification language to define a large collection of reusable neurodata types for storing a large set of neurophysiology data types and to define their organization as part of the NWB file hierarchy. One core concept that you will very quickly come across in the NWB format is the idea of a time series. A time series defines a base type for any kind of time series data and recording. It then breaks out into more specific types such as electrical series for extracellular recordings, image series for optical physiology recordings, or patch clamp series for intracellular electrophysiology recordings. And so NWB provides neurodata types for most neurophysiology recordings from extracellular and intracellular electrophysiology, optical physiology, behavior, stimuli, and experimental metadata. And so if you would like to know more about these specific areas, or all of them, then please visit our introductions to NWB for intracellular electrophysiology, extracellular electrophysiology, and optical physiology tomorrow morning. And so, and as I mentioned, in addition to the types that are in the schema, NWB also supports the concept of extensions. Using the NWB specification language, we can define new types of data as well and metadata. And so here, I just want to show you a short example of what it means to define an extension. You will be able to learn more about extensions in much more detail in the tutorial on Wednesday. And so in this particular example, we define an extension to store the cortical surface of the brain. The extension contains a data set of vertices, which describe the XYZ location of our points, and an array with faces, which describes how these points triangulate to form the surface. And so with PyNWB, we provide a dedicated API that allows us to easily define these extensions. Similar to how we can create a file with a library like H5Py, we can create groups, datasets, and attributes. Only now, instead of creating an actual data file, what we do is we create a definition of how data needs to look. And so in this case, what we do is we first create a group that's named surface, to which we then add one by one the different data sets for vertices and faces. And then finally, we create a namespace where this extension is defined in, and then we call export to save everything to disk. And when we call export, what happens is that we create a set of YAML files that follow our specification language that define then the schema of that extension. And now, once we have those YAML files with the schema for extension, we can use them immediately to read and write our data. And so in PyNWB, what we do is we first load our extension with the load namespace function. And then using the getClass method, we can then immediately dynamically create container classes to represent that data in memory. And so then we can populate those classes with the data that we want to store. We can add, in this case, our surface class directly to an NWB file as a regular acquisition. And we can save that file as usual to disk. And so without having to do any extra implementation work, we are able to immediately explore and use our extension to write data. And similarly, we can also read the data directly again. Again, we first load our namespace in this case, and then we load the file as usual. And we can explore it with the classes that PyNWB creates for us. Similarly, in MatNWB, we can do the same thing. Here, we first create physical code from our extension using the generate extension function. And then using the classes that this generates, we can use them to load and explore the data in MATLAB. And so if you want to learn more about extensions, I highly recommend that you visit the NWB Extensions tutorial on Wednesday, that Ryan will give. And so next up then is what data storage does. It looks at how we can map the primitives that we define in our specification language, groups, data sets, attributes, and maps them to disk. And so NWB currently uses HDF5 as its main file storage backend. And we choose HDF5 because it supports large-scale storage of complex data collections in a single file. It is optimized for performance. It supports parallel I/O, advanced I/O filters such as compression, and it's supported across platforms and programming languages such as MATLAB, Python, C, C++, Fortran, R, and many others. And it targets long-term support, which is really important for us for data preservation and sharing. And we're also working on exploring, as part of PyNWB and HDMF, other storage options such as ZAR, as well as integrations with database-oriented management systems such as DataJoin. But currently, HDF5 is the main storage backend we support for NWB. NWB supports through HDF5 a number of advanced I/O features. For example, we support lazy data load, which allows us to open even large files efficiently without having to load all the data into memory. Chunking allows us to optimize data layouts for storage and I/O. I/O filters such as compression allow us to reduce data sizes for storage to save cost. And with HDF5, we also support self-contained data storage as well as modular data storage. Self-contained storage means that we allow you to store all data in a single file, which is very good for sharing. But we also support modular storage, where you can store data across many different files and integrate that data through external links. And then finally, we also support iterative data write, which supports data streaming, and it helps us to reduce memory cost. For example, when you want to convert very large data files that do not fit into memory. And so to learn more about advanced I/O features, visit our tutorials on September 23rd on advanced write in PyNWB and MetNWB. And so as the last component of our ecosystem, we have our data APIs, PyNWB for Python and MetNWB for MATLAB. Both APIs are interoperable. That is, NWB files that you write with MetNWB can be read in PyNWB and vice versa. And both APIs support efficient read, write, query, and analysis of NWB files, including support for streaming, chunking, and compression. And so to learn more about PyNWB and MetNWB, visit the tutorials in the morning on Tuesday and Wednesday. These tools will be used in all of those tutorials. And so at the end of my talk, I want to go back to our original motivation for NWB that we discussed in the beginning of my talk, and talk a little bit more about the energy barriers to data standardization. And so coming from a world where data exists in arbitrary diverse formats, we want to move towards a world where data is standardized. And so this process naturally requires a significant amount of effort, not just because we have to learn a new data standard, but because it requires us to look at our data in a new way, to consider aspects of our data that we may not have thought of, and possibly follow more rigorous protocols than what we're currently using. For example, in order to enable reuse of data, we may need to record additional metadata that may not have been essential for our particular analysis or that we just implicitly use. And so the question then is, how can we make it easier to move over this hump and allow us to standardize the data we create? And so there are a few different approaches that together can help us get there. The first part is the sticks approach, where funding depends on our ability to standardize our data. And the other part of this is the carrots approach, which are things like analysis and visualization tools that help us understand our data and gain scientific insights once the data is standardized that we may not have been able to gain otherwise. And the last key piece is guidance, to train users and developers to lower the barrier of entry into the data standard, which is really the goal of this workshop, to help you learn about NWB and to help you apply and use NWB for your research. And so there is a large number of things that we're doing to engage with the community and provide guidance. We've been hosting the NWB User Days for a few years now, which has been very successful for us. And the Kavli and Simons Foundations have supported a number of efforts to facilitate adoption of NWB through seed grants. And we're engaging with the community through extension proposals to help us adapt NWB to community needs. In addition, there is a large number of user engagement activities that we do through talks and tutorials at neuroscience conferences, through one-on-one engagements with neuroscience teams, as well as community discussion and survey. We're also looking towards industry to help us grow the NWB community and broaden the portfolio of NWB technology, which includes ongoing engagements with companies such as Catalyst Neuro, Kitware, Vidrio, MathWorks, Vades, Novella Neurotech, and others. We also have a formal governance structure through the NWB Executive Board, as well as our funders, which also helps us to stay engaged with the broader community. And then finally, everything we do is open source. You can find all our resources online at nwb.org. You can engage with us through Slack and GitHub issues. We have a Twitter account and YouTube channel, and we have a growing set of online documentation and tutorials. And so because all our software is open source, you can also contribute to that software, whether it is through issues or pull requests where you can propose new features. And so the next part that helps us then to adopt data standards is dedicated funding, both to support development of the standards itself, as well as funding to user projects to help adopt, standardize, and publish data. And so many neuroscience projects now include data science cores to address the data challenges for these projects. And so another aspect of this then is also to make data standardization and sharing mandatory. And so, for example, the NIH Brain Initiative now mandates that all data generated by Brain Initiative projects must be shared through the appropriate data standards. And other initiatives and funders are increasingly making similar mandates. But ultimately, what helps us move to a world where our data is standardized is when our users are self-motivated to use data standards. And the way we do this is through carrots that allow us to really reap the benefits of using data standards. This comes through access to analysis, visualization, data management tools that help us understand our data better, that allow us to improve the quality of our analysis, and that provide us access to new analytics. It also comes through reduction in cost and effort. It allows us to reuse data in analysis, and it allows us to analyze our data in new ways and share our data with others. And it ultimately helps foster collaboration and team science. And ultimately, it allows us for new scientific discoveries by allowing you to combine your data in new ways, access and compare with other data, and engage with other scientists. It is really then that people get excited about adopting data standards because we can see how it benefits us in our research. And so in conclusion, going back to our original motivation, how does NWB solve problems in data sharing? We said sharing neurophysiology data is tedious. Well, data in NWB can be understood by anyone that is familiar with the standard. We said data have limited reuse outside of the purview of original experiments. Data in NWB is designed to have sufficient metadata to be reused. And it's really exciting when we see folks picking up data from others and applying their methods or integrate their data with these other types of data. We have seen this a few times on previous workshops, and it's really cool when people start learning about other people's data. And then finally, performing analysis visualization requires converting data from one esoteric format to another. Again, NWB here can help us keep our data in one format and be able to access a growing number of neurophysiology tools while remaining all data in the same standard. And so finally, I wanted to mention that NWB is really an exercise in multidisciplinary team science. We're working with many people from many different institutions and scientific disciplines. There are way more people than I can possibly list on a single slide. But I really wanted to thank everyone that has contributed to NWB, all our developers, all our funders and supporters, and all of you all our users. And so with this, I hope you have a great time at the NWB User Days, that you will learn a lot of new things, meet new people, and make progress on your NWB related projects. And visit us at nwb.org. And so if you have any questions, let me know.
We have one question from Murali in the chat.
All right, let me see. I have a hard time seeing the chat with the slides on. Okay, so the question is, taking the example that I showed for the extension of vertices and faces, wouldn't it be better to incorporate other standards such as VTK? It's an excellent question. There's always a question of when do we start leaving the standard and when is it better to stay within NWB. For example, for movies or certain imaging data, it certainly makes sense to look more towards integrating with those other standards because there's such a large ecosystem around them. For other aspects, it makes sense to standardize what we have because our use cases are more specialized sometimes. So on the particular example that I showed for the surface extension, it certainly would make sense to look also towards other standards, which is in part why this is an extension right now. We're still discussing this with the community, what's the right approach about dealing with geometries. VTK is just one of many standards that exists in that world. And in particular for neurophysiology, there is no accepted standard right now in that particular area. So the question is whether you have a standard for simulated data. There is a Sonata extension for the outputs of simulation data. And so that extension has been used for dealing with the results, as well as in part for describing some of the structure of the simulated data. But in general, simulation data is still something that is at the beginning of our exploration. So there's a lot of modules that can help you support simulated data, but there's a lot of components that we do not have yet. And then there's, again, the question then of which aspects are we taking on as NWB versus other aspects where there are already existing standards, for example, for describing the models that are used in simulations. I believe certainly we would have to link to the existing standards rather than trying to create our own standards. And I think we have a small enough group. If you have questions, you can also unmute yourself right now and ask them directly if you want to. So I'm not quite sure, Balaji, what you were asking. Are you asking whether NWB is already used in Asian countries?
Oliver, if you could repeat the question.
So, okay, so the question that was asked in private chat is whether NWB is already used in Asian countries to share data and collect it. We certainly had a number of engagements in Asian countries, whether it's in Japan or China, in part through the International Brain Initiative. But I have to admit, I don't know exactly what the penetration is of NWB in the Asian market. My feeling is it's probably not that far yet in that space, but it's hard to tell. So if there's no more questions, then I would suggest we can take a 5-minute break. I will certainly stay online so you can ask more questions. And then we'll have in 8 minutes the showcase of the NWB tools. But I will be online so you can keep asking questions.